Thanks, Corla. I just wanted to maybe make a couple of brief points. I think it is appropriate to step back and look at where prison policy is going, not just in the context of issues of human rights and how you judge a civilised society, but also particularly against the backdrop of austerity, the minute analysis of where taxpayers' money is spent and do we get value for that money. Are our prisons, if you like, operating to make society a safer place? Do they act as a deterrent for people going into crime? Are they value for money? Or is there a better way in which we could organise things? And I think they are valid questions to be asked, and I don't think that we ask them enough. And the reality is that the majority of people in our prisons are there for socio-economic factors. They're the victims of poverty, of abuse, and of, in many instances, the cycle of drugs and drug abuse in particular. And unless we address those root causes, an investment of resources into those areas would make society a far safer place, would be a greater value for money to my mind than spending an enormous amount of money on prisons per se. My own belief is that prisons serve very little purpose whatsoever. I think they're an institution for people outside rather from the people within, and they don't make things any better. In many ways, we've seen enough analysis to know that they're a sort of a holding operation, a temporary reprieve for many of the people who spend some time in prison to go back out for a brief spell only to come back in again the next time without any rehabilitation, without any repayment of their debt to society. In fact, their crime results in society paying a huge cost to keep them in prison, and then they're back in again a couple of months later. And I do think we need to take a step back and look at where we're going in that regard. I spent a month in Mountjoy Women's Prison previously, a prison which we laud as being more enlightened for its thinking, with had a more rehabilitative impact initially, at least. We'd have to say that has rolled back considerably from its early years. In my experience being in there, most of the people in there were victims of poverty, drug abuse or sexual abuse in their youth. They needed assistance, they needed an intervention, and it was costing at that stage, I know it's come down a bit, but about 80,000 per head to keep somebody in there, whereas if they got an intervention early on in life and so on, it would have been far cheaper for everybody, the women themselves and those upon whom they committed the offences that led them in there in the first place. And I do think we need to see the discussion in that context. Now, obviously Cork Prison was infamous for its appalling standards, and indeed for some of the conduct that went on there in terms of the treatment of people, which certainly didn't lead to people coming out better citizens. If anything else, I'd imagine it made them even worse, tormented individuals, the amount of solitary confinement, stories about people being stripped to their boxer shorts, left in rooms for days on end, and so on, and a very reprehensible type of culture that no civilised person could stand over. And I think when we're looking at improving Cork Prison, which is a good thing in some ways, we do have to look at that with a critical eye. And I do think it's not good enough that this has been rushed through. It's very poor that on a Thursday evening it's been guillotined, that the notice for motions was very, very limited, and that the one motion which was put in as an amendment was being struck and dealt with out of order. I don't think that that's good enough to rush these things through. I mean, we're talking about potentially 310 people being incarcerated in this new prison. If we're putting in taxpayers' money into this, we should at least know that what we're doing properly and starting it out from the start on a proper footing. And I do think in that context it's a missed opportunity, and it's a missed opportunity not to include the amendment that Deputy Wallace put forward about single cell occupancy, which is against all best practice, which is against your own previous statements, Minister, that this was the way forward and should be the only way in which to deal with people. Now, I'm not sure why this has been rushed through in such a short space of time. Organisations that I know you would have respect for, like Jesuits and so on, have been certainly in contact with our office, very concerned at the speed and that points haven't been taken on board. Now, I was kind of going to give you the benefit of the doubt and say maybe the rush is on to clear a bit of space for a few of the Anglo criminals or whatever to go in, make a bit of space and rush it in, but sadly I don't think that is going to be the case. That I think our prisons will continue to hold those from a lower socio-economic backdrop, but we are doing them or the taxpayer no favour by putting in inadequate systems from the beginning. And there is a serious problem about planning double cell occupancy from the very beginning. It's against all best practice. It's against the experience that is underway in trying to improve the situation in Mountjoy. Why would you do that on the one hand in Mountjoy and then take a retrograde step in terms of Cork? There's a clear contradiction there. There's a clear breach of international best practice, because I know that the Minister did say last week that the new prison would provide what he called adequate and suitable accommodation for all prisoners. Well, you know, is that really true? Because, I mean, Article 18.5 of the European Prison Rules says that prisoners shall normally be accommodated during the night in individual cells, except where it's preferable for them to share sleeping accommodation. Father Peter McVerry, who is the expert on this area, said that cell sharing should not be the norm. In many cases, it results in increased intimidation and violence and leads to non-drug users being introduced to drug use, and forced sharing can represent a very cramped and oppressive living environment, given that in Ireland out-of-cell time is at best only 6 or 7 hours a day. So it's not just about, you know, talking about people doubling up, it's about enforcing people into a very small space to endure the company of somebody else for the overwhelming part of their day. And I think that is a serious issue which must be addressed. I mean, you know, we do have obligation under the Council of Europe for ensuring that prison conditions don't infringe on human dignity, that give proper occupational facilities and so on. And, you know, in that sense, I think the decision should be debated out a bit more and not rushed through in this way. The very fact that we're building a bigger prison as well is a problem for me. I have to say, again, best practice internationally would show we should be moving away from bigger prisons, and this one is planning a population greater than what's there before, including a doubling up from the beginning and a planned doubling up, which is just really not on, you know. I think other deputies have referred to points that, you know...
Okay, just to let you know your time slot is finished.
Well,
if you could just wrap up.
You could have given me a warning. But look, I think other deputies have made points in terms of in-cell sanitation, and that's obviously welcome. But, you know, unless this is a fully walled facility, well then, you know, sure, it might as well not be there, and there still is an abuse of people's privacy. I would again maybe appeal to the government to push back from this rushing through of this, and to look, even at this late hour, to provide for single cell occupancy as being in accord with best international practice, and as a measure in stepping back and overlooking at our overall prison policy, which to me is a monumental waste of money and doesn't serve the taxpayer, the victims of crime, or those carrying out unlawful activities any good whatsoever.